So as I mentioned during the welcome, this is our third week diving into the story of Jesus feeding the 5,000 in the Gospel of John. And if you were here for that first week, we had Pastor Joy with us. She's a pastor in St. Paul, one of our partners, and she spoke about how this story comes alive in her ministry every day. Last week, Pastor Dan spoke about this story in terms of how we can all become a community of abundance. And today, we're going to look at a variety of different ways that Christians have interpreted and entered into this story, and then dive into one very particular detail. If you got the Animate email from Trinity this week, you know that I sent out this story and asked you to read it on your own and think about it using 4 different questions. Those questions were, what details stand out for you in this story? Where in this story do you feel invited to fill in the gaps with your imagination? What insights occurred to you? And 4, what questions were sparked in you? And then I asked you to send me your thoughts. And I heard from 2 of you. Thanks, Tim Korberg. Tim was one of them. But he went to seminary, so I don't know if he really counts. Just kidding, Tim. So then I started thinking, well, I know that it's not that people don't have thoughts about this story, because you all are very smart and have thoughts, I know. And so then I thought, well, maybe, a lot of people just didn't have time, they didn't get to it. That was probably true for a lot of you. But then I thought maybe there was a third group of people who read it, thought through the questions, maybe even started to type something out, and then thought, I don't know if I want to send this to the pastor because, what if it's not the right interpretation, or what if she thinks I'm dumb, or, all those fears and insecurities that linger inside of us. And so I thought I would spend a little bit of time this morning just trying to reassure you that I really do want to hear from you when I say that, and I promise I won't think you're dumb or judge your ideas. My husband and I, just to take a tour around this a little bit, my husband and I went to Chicago for the weekend for a little getaway without our daughter. And so as a part of that, we actually had an entire day to spend at the Chicago Institute of Art. How many of you have ever spent any time there? It's a fabulous museum. And my husband and I were walking around together, and we were drawn into one of the galleries, which was filled with Southeast Asian art, mostly religious art, a lot of statues, actually, of Buddha and different gods, Hindu gods, and all kinds of different religious traditions. And I don't really know that much about Eastern religion. My husband's more interested in it, so he was kind of my guide through it a little bit, and I spent a lot of time reading through plaques and studying a lot of these statues that have a lot of very intricate detail. And I just walked away from that experience, even though I spent, almost the whole day learning about it, realizing and thinking to myself, this is one of those times where the more you know about something, or the more you learn about it, the more you realize how much you don't know. And some of you are shaking your heads, nodding your heads. And it reminded me of a similar experience I had in college when I was taking quantum chemistry. And, that's one of those classes where it just totally blows your mind, and you're studying, and you're doing all these equations, and you got to bring all your calculus in and everything you've learned from chemistry. And at the end of the semester, I just thought, wow, I've learned a lot, but I realize how much I don't know about this universe and how much scientists don't know. And it was the same kind of experience of the more you learn and know about something, the more you realize that you don't know. And I think for a lot of us, the Bible kind of falls into that category as well. I know it does for me. When I was in seminary, everyone has to take an introduction to the Old Testament class. And the Old Testament really takes up most of the Bible, so it's a lot of survey material, a lot of trying to get your head around all the different stories and books. And at the end of that class, the final was an oral exam. So, I diligently studied and prepared, and when I went in there, I hoped that the professor would ask me the questions that I had studied for, so that I would be able to say something intelligent in that moment. And I thought I did pretty well, through most of the thing, and then at the end of the oral exam, she said, on a scale of 1 to 10, 10 being that you could teach this class, how would you rank yourself? And I just started going on and on about how, the more I study the Old Testament, the more I realize I don't know, and, scholars devote their whole lives to studying one particular passage within one particular book, and, there's no way, I can't teach this class yet. And so I, very honestly and innocently said, well, I'd give myself a 2. And she kind of made this funny face and hesitated, and she said, well, I'm really asking you to give yourself a grade for the class. So then I kind of, backpedaled, and I was like, well, really, an 8. An 8 would be good, yeah. But honestly, a lot of times with the Bible, I still feel like I'm in that 2 category. Because the more that I learn, the more that I realize I don't know. And that is a very normal experience. So I just want to reassure all of you that the Bible can feel like that. The more you learn, the more you study, the more you dive in, the more you realize that you don't know. And yet, as people of faith, these are our central stories. And so we need to learn to kind of move beyond our fear and dig in there for ourselves so that we can really make a personal connection with these stories. After all, it is part of our tradition as Lutherans. Martin Luther was very insistent that every single person should be able to read and interpret the Bible for themselves. So it wasn't up to the Pope and the priest to read it and tell everyone else what to think. He really wanted everybody to get in there, to dig into the stories, and to make a personal connection with them. And that is our heritage and our legacy and a part of our tradition. So part of what I want to do today is just to kind of open up this one story for you and create a little space in the hopes that you might feel a little bit more comfortable diving in on your own. So in a minute, I'm going to ask you to actually talk to the people sitting next to you. But first, I'm going to read the story again so it's fresh in your minds. And I'm going to invite you just to pay attention to that first question I sent out in the email, which is, what detail or details stand out for you when you hear this story today? So just try to focus in on one detail that catches your attention. So here we go from the Gospel of John, chapter 6. After this, Jesus went to the other side of the Sea of Galilee, also called the Sea of Tiberias. A large crowd kept following him because they saw the signs that he was doing for the sick. Jesus went up the mountain and sat down there with his disciples. Now the Passover, the festival of the Jews, was near. When he looked up and saw a large crowd coming toward him, Jesus said to Philip, "Where are we to buy bread for these people to eat?" Jesus said this to test him, for he himself knew what he was going to do. Philip answered him, 6 months' wages would not buy enough bread for each of them to get a little. One of his disciples, Andrew, Simon Peter's brother, said to him, "There is a boy here who has 5 barley loaves and 2 fish. But what are they among so many people?" Jesus said, "Make the people sit down." Now there was a great deal of grass in the place, so they sat down, about 5,000 in all. Then Jesus took the loaves, and when he had given thanks, he distributed them to those who were seated. So also the fish, as much as they wanted. When they were satisfied, he told his disciples, "Gather up the fragments left over so that nothing may be lost." So they gathered them up, and from the fragments of the 5 barley loaves left by those who had eaten, they filled 12 baskets. When the people saw the sign that he had done, they began to say, "This is indeed the prophet who is to come into the world." When Jesus realized that they were about to come and take him by force to make him king, he withdrew again to the mountain to be by himself. Here ends our reading from the Gospel of John. So I want to give you or describe for you 4 different lenses or entry points that Christians have used throughout Christian history to enter into this story. And as I describe these 4, I invite you to find one, perhaps, that resonates more closely with where you are today. So the first group of Christians would read this story or hear this story and take it pretty much at face value. This is a story about Jesus who has an amazing and miraculous power such that he can take just a few loaves of bread and a few fish and transform them into lots and lots of bread and lots of fish, enough to feed 5,000 people. And because Jesus can do things like that, that is proof that he is, in fact, God. So that's one way that people might enter into this story, and that might be you. Another way that Christians have entered into this story is to say, you know, the real miracle here that Jesus started was he gathered up some bread and some fish, and he set an example as he started to pass it out. Everybody else had brought food because they were going to be away from home for the day. So they pulled out their bread and their fish and whatever else they had, and they started eating it and sharing it, and all of that sharing created this feast, an experience of abundance. And that's the real miracle here. So that's another way you might be connecting with that one. A third way that Christians have entered into this story is to say, you know, this is really an interesting story. And it tells us something important about God, that God wants everyone to have enough to eat. But, you know, I'm not really sure that miracles like this can happen, you know, bread multiplying and such. I don't really think it's scientifically possible. And yet, I still can find a deeper meaning in this story. So that's a third way that Christians have entered in, and that might be close to where you are. A fourth way that Christians have thought about this story is to say, you know, Jesus spent a lot of time teaching by the Sea of Galilee, and we know that. There's a lot of stories about that. But really what happened here is the author of the Gospel of John made up a lot of details in this story to make larger points about Jesus being the bread of life and about how the crowds always seemed to miss the point of what Jesus was doing. Because here he is, you know, creating this meal of abundance, and what is their response? Their response is to try to take him by force and make him king, so he has to retreat. So it's a parable about how the crowds just never get it. So those are 4 different entry points that Christians have taken into this story. And what I'd like to invite you to do now is to turn to some people sitting next to you and talk about which one of those 4 most closely connects with where you are right now, and then also share what was the detail when I was reading the story that really caught your attention. So take some time and turn to the people next to you and have some conversation. The questions are up on the screen for you to see. So take about one more minute and wrap up your conversations. So in closing today, I want to briefly share with you the detail that really struck me this time around. And to help us do that, I have put a few things on your Animate card if you just want to pull that out so you have that to look at. So I heard this story fresh in July when I was at a stewardship conference, and we had spent 3 days talking about giving and abundance and generosity and gratitude and stewardship. And so when I heard this story, I was really listening through that lens. And the phrase or the verse that particularly stood out for me was verse 11. Then Jesus took the loaves, and when he had given thanks, he distributed them to those who were seated. And a little bit later in that worship service, when we were celebrating communion, the pastor got up to bless the bread and the wine and said those familiar words. In the night in which he was betrayed, our Lord Jesus took bread, gave thanks, broke it, and gave it to his disciples. And so I was really interested in that little phrase, that little detail of Jesus giving thanks in these two cases. And my first thought was, well, Jesus, he really gets this whole gratitude thing. He's got it down. Before serving people bread, he always pauses to give thanks. What a great guy. He totally gets it. And then I thought, I wonder if there's more to that. And so I just started doing a little research, and I discovered that Jesus probably learned to give thanks as a young Jewish boy growing up, because a part of the Jewish tradition is that every time you are about to eat a meal that includes bread, you pray a very specific prayer. And I've put that prayer on your Animate card here. It's, "Blessed are you, O Lord our God, ruler of the universe, who brings forth bread from the earth." So for 30 years growing up as a Jewish boy, Jesus likely prayed this very prayer at least once a day, maybe more times a day, anytime he was gathered with others to eat bread. And so there was this very tangible connection for him between God's provision and the food that he was eating. And so then it shouldn't be a surprise to us that when Jesus grew up and began his ministry, and it was his turn to preside at meals such as the feeding of the 5,000 or at communion or the Last Supper, that he would have started out those meals by giving thanks, likely using this exact prayer. And most of the people who were with him and the crowds and his disciples were also Jewish, and they probably knew this prayer by heart. And so they all prayed it aloud together before sharing in these sacred meals. And so I think what this shows for us, or what it calls out to me, is that Jesus really had developed this habit of gratitude. And he connected God's provision very regularly to the things of his daily life. And in so doing, that habit over and over and over again, using the same words of this prayer for the blessing of bread, he would have grown in his trust of God's abundance, out of which then flowed his generosity, right? So Jesus grew up with this habit of giving thanks to God for the bread, learning to trust in God's abundance, and then going out in his ministry totally generous with his love and forgiveness and mercy and grace and presence. So in this story, through that one detail, we can just see the connection between these faith practices, which we talk a lot about here at Trinity, of gratitude, trusting in God's abundance, and becoming generous people. And we see that modeled in Jesus through this small detail, through this simple daily habit of connecting bread to God's provision. That's just one of the interesting details in this story, one interpretation that we might draw out of it or feel called by God to respond to. It's certainly not the only interpretation. It's not the only interesting detail in this story. And you might have another interpretation or another detail that caught your attention today. And if that's the case, I invite you to trust that, to follow it, to maybe Google something about it, to do a little research, to dig a little deeper, and to find out more about what interests you in this story. My hope is that we will all have the courage to move through our fears and insecurities and feeling like we might be amateurs, and really invest ourselves in developing a personal connection with the Bible and with these stories that are so important to us in our faith tradition. Because by drawing ourselves into these stories in a more deeply personal way, we will encounter God and grow in our relationship with Jesus. So may these stories continue to be a blessing to you. May you come to them again and again to find God speaking to you through them. Amen.